College football nerds here talking, well, you know what we're talking, the national championship game. It's TCU and Georgia. And as always, your homework. Really, you got two pieces of homework this time. Give us your score prediction in the comments. We're going to get down there and mix it up with you. And two, share this where you can. Wherever you talk football, let people know that we are here to talk Georgia and TCU. All right, Josh, both of these games were super fun, super interesting, went a little different than maybe our predictions, though we said in both of these predictions, we missed them both, that it would not surprise us if Ohio State won. It would not surprise us if TCU won. And we even commented at the end of, I think it was the Michigan-Ohio State video, that we're a lot less confident about our picks this year than we were last year when we picked in the first round with it was Alabama, Cincinnati, and Georgia and Michigan. So it turned out that not only were these two, really close games, but they were super high scoring. And I've heard a lot of people trashing the Georgia defense, trashing Michigan, Ohio State, and TCU defenses. And I'd love for you to get us into this with a little bit of a context around that, where high-scoring games at this level, at this stage of the game, doesn't necessarily mean you're dealing with bad defenses.
There are a lot of things that come into play when you're playing elite-level competition. And something that I like to say, and if you like it, you can like and subscribe to the video, is that when you play big-time competition, you tend to step up. We've seen it a lot in playoff circumstances where teams in these scenarios tend to play their best football. And I'll give you an example of that. So the Georgia Bulldogs, throughout the season, have been averaging about 7 yards per play. Do you know what their two highest yardage output games were? Number one was Oregon at 9.2 yards per play. Number two was Ohio State at 8.88 yards per play. So when you talk about these games, right, you talk about how defenses suck or whatnot, I think a lot of it comes from fans that don't watch the other team all season, or they don't watch you all season. I mean, the reality is Ohio State gave up the most yardage they'd given up in a game all year to Georgia. Georgia had the most yardage they had gained all year against Ohio State. For Ohio State, it's a team that averaged 7.3 yards per play in the season. They had 7.1 yards per play. No, that's a yard and a half less than what Georgia had. We can probably touch on that later about anybody saying Georgia was outplayed in this game. But Ohio State was just slightly below their season average. Georgia actually exceeded their season average. That's pretty normal. I mean, teams are playing wide open. There's no garbage time here. There's nothing being held back. Everybody's going full bore. You know that you've got to take risks in the game, which means you're taking more deep shots than normal. That sometimes results in turnovers, but you've got to score. So you're trying to score more. You're trying to score more often. And something we talked about a lot in this is Georgia in a typical game often only plays about 10 to 12 possessions. And in this Ohio State-Georgia game, I think there were like 17 meaningful possessions in the game. So these games also end up being a lot longer from a play count perspective, from a meaningful drive perspective, because there's more passes being thrown. There are more explosive plays, which means you score in fewer plays, which means there's more drives. Everything sort of compounds, and you end up with higher scoring games. But, there are two things to note. One, in some of the metrics we do use, for example, Ohio State was below their average in yard per play production, if you can believe it. Ohio State was just that good offensively. And two, Georgia hit the same sort of heights they hit against the Oregon game, which just shows this is really what peak Georgia looks like.
Yeah, and a lot of people were getting at us on Twitter because we were talking about this, how this just happens in big games. And they were like, oh, what are you talking about? Michigan still scored 45 points. But that's another kind of possession thing that you were talking about. Michigan scored 45 points, but it was 21-6 at the half. And Michigan could not keep TCU from scoring. And not only were they scoring quickly. And two of TCU's scores were defensive scores, which means you've got back-to-back possessions for the opposing offense. And at some point, all of those quick turnaround possessions and adding the fact that they have to score, so like you said, they are implementing more verticality. They are taking more risks, and a lot of them paid off late in the game. They just couldn't stop TCU from scoring. That sort of thing leads to a higher score without necessarily informing on bad defenses. However,
and Yeah, and let me add there too. The Michigan in that game had 18 possessions. So going back to the point I made earlier, Michigan typically plays about 12. They had 50% more possessions in the game. So even when you look at 45 points, that 45 points represents what would normally be like a 30-point game for Michigan. They just had the ball 50% more than they normally do. Sort of the nature of these games.
And you've got some video that's going to showcase some of these things for both Georgia and Michigan. And I think we can start with Georgia first, where, we do want to give the caveat that you see these high-scoring games in these big-time competitions, but also there was some actual bad defense played. And, maybe get into that. I'll note just from a statistical standpoint, J.J. McCarthy throwing for 10.1 yards per attempt is not a great look for TCU's defense, but they did hold them to 4.7 yards per attempt rushing. So there's some numbers there that might speak to it, but maybe there's also some stuff schematically, some stuff you saw on tape that you want to walk us through. Let's start with Georgia.
Yeah, and I'm not going to try to belabor too much of this, so I'm not going to go deep dive into the schemes and formations that are used, but I'm going to try to just show you a couple plays that I thought were instructive of what was going on in the game and why things went the way they did. One of the things I often talk about when we have these high-level football games is that there are unique challenges presented when you play teams that have a lot of different weapons on offense. Offense dictates the flow of football. I often talk about being asymmetric. And what I mean by that is, an offense can be pass-based, it can be run-based, you can be a vertical attack, you can be a short passing attack. There are all these things that go together, and if you're really good at one thing, you can win a football game. An example I've always thrown out was 2016 Clemson in their national title. Could not run to save their lives, but they had Deshaun Watson, and they had some receivers that were studs, and they threw it down the field like crazy. Was it Mike Wallace, right? Way back when. I think in this game, Georgia faced some challenges that they really had only seen one other time, and that other time was probably the end of the LSU game. Ohio State has 4 or 5 guys at wide receiver that are NFL caliber, or are going to be likely draft picks. They were able to spread the field with them. You have Egbuka, but you also have Harrison, you've got Fleming, and you have the depth, which is also really good. So there was really no way to bracket any one guy and be effective for the majority of that game. The same thing happened, I think, to Georgia in the LSU game late. Now, we overlooked that a little bit because it's a little screwy, right? They bring in Nussmeier. It was a game where they had a huge lead early. I don't know how much focus they had. I don't know how much they prepared for that quarterback. But in Ohio State's case, they definitely had prepared for him more. And I think what you saw in the same way LSU with their cadre of receivers, which make no mistake, with Butte and Neighbors and everybody they have, that's actually one of the best receiving corps in football. Ohio State's is a notch above that. And I think it exposed some things. And in particular, we'll show one clip here. And what you'll see here is Harrison on the left side of the field that's just running a little up. It's almost like a slant that he's faking, and then he cuts out. And Lassiter, the Georgia DB, is in coverage. Now, Lassiter, I think, maybe was one of their weaker defensive backs. He's had some issues in coverage throughout the season. Ringo was seen as the star. But I think in this game, Lassiter got exposed a little bit, especially early, playing a team that was able to spread Georgia out so much that they couldn't give him help. And what you see here is Lassiter gets completely turned around on this out route. Harrison just sort of makes him look a little bit like a fool, to be honest, breaks to the outside, and they get a completion. It took Georgia a long time to adjust to this, and really at some level they never quite did. They struggled with the fact that Ohio State, especially early in this game, could put guys all over the field and attack anywhere they wanted to, and you weren't able to bracket. Now, something I'll note on that is it's a little hard to take that towards the TCU game. TCU does have a lot of offensive weapons. You want to talk Barber, you want to talk, obviously, Johnston. There are a lot of things that they can do offensively that give you problems, but I'm not sure it's quite the same depth that Ohio State has. And I don't say that as a slight. Ohio State's depth was really unique in college football this year. In fact, it's probably one of the deepest units in many years in the wide receiver position. And I think it's telling that later in the game, when Harrison went down, Georgia had a lot more success. I saw another one. We're not going to show this clip. There's another example where they run a double slots concept, and they try to throw the ball to Egbuka. Harrison's out hurt, and Georgia actually brackets him. And it really changed the dynamics of what Ohio State wanted to do. But in that play, you can kind of see how when they were in isolation coverage, and they run this pattern match scheme, which you got a lot of one-on-one man coverage, there are guys on Georgia secondary that can get beat. And I think it's a different team when they can keep the safeties down, they can bracket guys and be comfortable the way they were most of the year. But against Ohio State, they just really weren't able to do that because of the number of weapons spread across the field. All right, now let's turn to the second clip I want to show from Georgia. And this was a deep throw for a touchdown, and it was a big play from Stroud, but there's one thing I want you to pay attention to. How long Ohio State has to throw this football. From snap to throw, by my count, it was about 7 seconds. And now the average time to throw in college football hovers around 3 seconds generally. In the NFL, you generally get somewhere between 2.5 to 4 seconds to throw the football, depending on the offensive line, really probably shading on the shorter side. Anytime you have a guy that has 7 seconds to throw the football, somebody's going to be open. And in a zone scheme, you can kind of deal with that because in zone coverage, right, you guys are just covering quarters of the field. And as the quarterback runs around and buys time, receivers are mostly just running from one zone to the other. There's always somebody there to cover. Now, there's times when they get in a hole and then, you got to see it. And that's why good quarterbacks tend to light up zone coverage because it's not really about waiting for someone to get open. It's realizing when they're going to be open, anticipating it, and throwing it when they're in the holes. Versus man, you can kind of sit and wait for him to come open. I think Michigan was able to prevent Stroud from having the time to sit there and wait for somebody to come up. But against Georgia, because of the injury to Nolan Smith, because of the fact in that game Chambliss gets hurt and they're down really to their third string edge rushers, Georgia had a difficult time containing Stroud in the pocket. That allowed Ohio State to extend plays, which meant that Georgia's man coverage scheme had some problems. It's something I think to pay attention to with TCU. We'll talk about this in a minute. We show some clips from TCU because I think TCU's scheme is very good about exploiting man coverage, particularly when it's overly aggressive and you don't have help over the top. So there were a lot of things that went into this Georgia game. I think some of it had to do with just surely the fact that Ohio State is that good. They can stress you in ways that no one else can, frankly, in ways TCU probably can't. Alabama would not have been able to do it either. They're just uniquely deep at the wide receiver position with a quarterback to match. But also, it did expose some problems that Georgia has. I don't know that they have elite, true cover corners, and they don't have a ton of speed on the edges. There's a big step back from last year, and the injuries at that position have really hampered them. So while they may be great against the run, and they may be able to push the pocket, they're not great about keeping you contained.
And I think that most Georgia fans, some won't agree, but most Georgia fans will agree with a lot of what you said, pointed out, and showing that there are some issues there. These issues were there last year with a better defense, frankly, but it was just that only one or two teams in the country could actually exploit it, and that's part of being good. Is it takes a certain set of matchups to be able to do anything to you. And then there's scaling issues where it falls off dramatically. Like if somebody can score 41 on you with all of those weapons and a good scheme, that means the next best team might only be able to score 25. Like there are legitimate scaling issues there. I think that Ohio State is a good bit better in terms of matchups here than TCU is offensively. On the flip side, just yes or no, Josh, do you agree TCU is much better defensively than Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And that's something that we were really kind of noting when we were looking at statistics, is Ohio State had been bullied a couple times defensively. Now, TCU and Ohio State both, in terms of our metrics, are pretty average defenses, frankly. But what we saw against Michigan, and I think the thing that really stood out the most in that game, was TCU's ability to handle Michigan and their physicality. TCU in the run game did not get pushed around. And yeah, they gave up some yards, but 4.6 yards per carry. It really wasn't that significant. It wasn't enough for Michigan to get going. And Michigan had been a team that had been feasting really on the ground game all year. And you could tell there was a lot of stuff offensively from Michigan that made them uncomfortable. You mind if we show a clip from Michigan and J.J. McCarthy, just to give an example right now?
This would be a good time to go ahead and get into those. And just for sake of my sanity and editing, let's do them all in one shot.
Sure. So we'll walk through them. And you guys, we don't do clips a lot. There's a lot of reasons for that. We just thought for this game it would be helpful to see why we come to the conclusions we do. Michigan as an offense was averaging 5.6 yards per carry roughly in the season, even after this game. Against Ohio State, they ran for over 7 yards a carry, 7.2 yards per carry, Penn State game they ran for 7.6. We had questioned all year whether that was sustainable. I mean, averaging over 7 yards a carry against good competition is rare. And we see on a pretty consistent basis that run games can be slowed or stopped completely. The better defenses in the last decade have often held teams to below 60% of their averages. And again, that 2016 example with one of the better defenses in recent history, Alabama completely shut down Clemson's run game, and they had to survive solely with the pass. Last year, Georgia's defense really clamped down on the run in the national title against Alabama and really shut down Michigan in the semifinal as well. So pretty consistently, you can't rely on the run. The question then becomes, okay, well, if you can't run the ball and teams can play you honest, can you throw it in those circumstances? It's one thing for Michigan to throw deep shots against Ohio State when Ohio State's walking up safeties. It's a different thing entirely to be able to throw the ball effectively against a team that's actually being able to drop players in coverage and throw safeties. Here's a clip from J.J. McCarthy, okay? And in this clip, I mean, you're going to see one of the two pick sixes. The first pick six from McCarthy was a long throw to the far hash. It kind of showed that McCarthy's arm maybe isn't completely elite. Floated it inside like he did a couple times, but it was a good play by the corner, breaking on it, scoring. This interception is just straight bad. There's a linebacker dropping into coverage. McCarthy is locked on the slot receiver from the jump. He throws that ball directly to the linebacker. There's no read confusion there. There's nothing fancy going on. It's just a guy with a DB on him. The guy's closely covered, and it's a linebacker dropping into a short zone. It's a little hard to see if it's man or zone coverage. It kind of seems like it may be the latter. You can see, though, in the back third, on the right-hand back third, there's a guy open. I mean, there's reads there to be made, but that was a Michigan passing game that just wasn't very sophisticated. And that, I think, showed the fact that because TCU can stop the run, that's the thing I want you to take away from it, because they were able to keep Michigan to below 5 yards per carry, they were able to play more sound on the defensive end. And Michigan got exposed as a team that when they had to throw in obvious passing situations and they had to throw traditional passes, not play-action bombs to wide-open receivers, McCarthy cannot execute at a high level and an efficient level. And so I think that's something TCU brings to the table. The other thing I want to show, though, is a little bit of what happened to Michigan in that game because of how much they were pressing. The physicality isn't just on the defensive end. I think it was on the offensive end, too. Michigan, as a run defense, was really stellar all year. They averaged 3.26 yards per carry allowed, even including the TCU game. TCU ran for 6.4 yards per carry in that game. No one else had gotten over 5. The only team to get 5 was Penn State. So TCU bullied them at a line of scrimmage in a way that no one in the Big Ten had. And I think that speaks a lot about the physicality of the TCU. And we talked a lot about how the Big Ten and the Big 12 were very difficult for us to judge. We talked about how in the semifinals, neither one of us really felt comfortable saying who was going to win. And there was a reason why we thought either team could win that game. And the reason was there was so much isolation. Now, we said it wouldn't shock us from the eye test if it turns out the Big 12 maybe wasn't quite who they were made out to be. I don't know that held up. The Big 12 played physical football in the bowls. Even in bowls they lost, they did well. Kansas State handled Alabama actually pretty well at the line of scrimmage. They really lost in the passing game on both sides. And really all throughout bowl season, I felt like they acquitted themselves well. Texas Tech pushed an SEC team around in their bowl too. The Big Ten, on the other hand, I'm not so sure it held up. I mean, they did well. I'm not saying they did poorly, but they didn't show that they were dominant physically for most of the bowl season. And I'm really loath to take too much from it because there's so many opt-outs and other things, but there certainly wasn't a lot there to tell me the Big Ten was superior. And given what I saw from TCU in the semifinal, I think they're a physical football team. What did that do to Michigan, to get back to the point? Well, what it caused Michigan to do is press. And we're going to show really 3 different clips here to show what happened to Michigan's pass defense as a result of the fact that they could not stop the run. Michigan had to bring outside pressure. They had to bring slot pressure. They had to bring corner pressure on a number of occasions. And a lot like what happened to Ohio State when they played Michigan, Michigan against TCU gave up a lot of very easy throws. A long touchdown pass on the left side to Johnston, they talked about this in the broadcast, is a complete bust. They bring a corner on a blitz. The safety does not roll over the top. All Duggan has to do is see him and throw the ball. He doesn't throw it hard. It is a veteran player that immediately recognizes what's going on to throw past the blitz. I almost feel like Duggan in that clip sort of blinks and realizes how open he is, and he floats the ball, doesn't put too much air under it, but puts an easy pass out to Johnston, lets him run for a score. And in the next two, you see really two similar things happening. You see guys that are blitzing from a slot corner position, which means you have a safety trying to cover a receiver, one on a deep breaking route across the field and one on a drag. And in both cases, the safety can't get there. On one of them, the guy's trying to cover Johnson deep down the field on the right side, can't really get more than 5 to 10 yards within him, and Johnston just runs down the field easy. All Duggan does is just put it up on the deep right third of the field, let Johnston run into it for a score. That play was caused because Michigan did not have an actual corner on man coverage with Johnston and help over the top. They went to a cover zero look, and they were in that look because of TCU's ability to run the football. It was something Michigan was not comfortable with, and you could tell that they really struggled when they were put in that position. The other one, which is a short crosser, you'll see the guy comes across the formation, catches the ball, and there's a heavy blitz coming. So Duggan, again, a veteran player, is backpedaling. It's something TCU does very well, reads the play, and just delivers the ball on the simple crosser, which is really a man-beater route. But because there's a blitzing corner, the guy dragging the receiver is a safety. And you'll see in that clip, a guy dives for the tackle. That's not even the safety covering him. That's actually a corner rolling off a different receiver. The safety trying to cover the guy on the crossing route isn't even in the frame. That's how badly they were beaten, because if you're a safety 10 yards deep and you got to cover a 3-yard crossing route and you got to run through all the traffic, it's just not going to happen. So what happened to Michigan in that game is TCU, to their credit, was able to run the ball very successfully, and Michigan, to their detriment, did not have a counter, and they were really, really porous on the defensive side of the ball, trying to cover the passing game when they had to go in situations where safeties were in isolated man coverage, or when they were blitzing, they were not sound. And so that shows TCU's ability to be dynamic in terms of the run and the pass. It shows Duggan's ability really not making spectacular throws here, but making good reads, understanding where the throw is going to be, understanding how to buy time for himself and making the decision. And all of that is set up around TCU's physicality against Michigan, and Georgia's ability to match that physicality, I think, is going to be one of the determining factors in the game as a result.
All right, well, why don't you get into the model and let us know what it says.
So the model for this game is interesting because it's close. And I'll note both our semifinal models had the games being closer than Vegas prediction. They had the same team favored. We talked about how the Big 12 we felt like was getting a 3-point disadvantage or something like that, close to it in Vegas on both sides of the line. And I think, again, it may have turned out that maybe the Big 12 was a little bit underappreciated because it ended up being a lot closer in many ways to our model. In this case, you see, again, a close score. Georgia 29, TCU 26. The key metrics I'd point to, Georgia is a much better run defense, 70% against the run. TCU is only 96%. Pass defense, Georgia is not fantastic, 88% against opponent passing averages, merely above average. But again, TCU is pretty average at 94%. So the key to this game really, in terms of predictions, is the fact that Georgia's offense, actually in a per-play sense, is better than TCU's. They average 5.6 yards per carry, 8.9 yards per attempt. TCU's at 5.4 and 8.4 respectively. We talked about this a lot. As good as TCU is offensively and as many points as they score, don't get lulled into a false sense of security. Georgia plays slow football. They don't have as many drives, so they don't score as many points. But on a per-play basis, if you have the same number of drives, Georgia is a top 3 offense in the country. They just play slower football. And so that's how you get this prediction, but I do think it's interesting that it's pretty close. Now, Georgia, 6.6 yards per play to TCU's 5.6. It's actually pretty significant, a yard per play advantage that suggests the score differential maybe should be a little more than it is. And again, I think this gets into some nuances with pacing, right? Georgia tends to play slower games than TCU. Even in our model, it's not going to really expect Georgia to score that many points because they rarely do because they don't play long games. But what we saw in the Ohio State game is when they get into a long game, they probably are going to score more points. So I do think this is probably conservative in TCU's favor, but it comes to a 29-26 prediction.
All right, I'm ready to make a prediction on this one. Ohio State fans have said all week that Harrison Jr. went down and that was the difference in the game. They failed to note that Washington went down, and that's, in terms of scheme, that's a big part of what Georgia was, it limited them a good bit. So that was a little frustrating to hear that kind of talking point. I think that's natural fan stuff. But coming into this game, I'm a little worried that Miller may not be able to. I mean, he's listed as questionable, may not be able to go. I do think that Max Duggan is going to give Georgia some trouble with his ability to run. My concern is I don't know that that's enough to, I think that what Stroud brought to the table is more important in terms of his ability to throw and those wide receivers. I don't know that his ability to move the ball with his legs is going to be enough to win the game. I do think that our defense is a good bit better than Ohio State's, even though statistically they're not too far apart. Give me Georgia 34, TCU 27, not covering the monster 13 and a half spread that's out there. It's also worth noting that, I like that our model's a lot closer. It may be closer than Georgia fans think is reasonable, but both our models last week covered in the semifinal games, they were a lot closer, or a good bit closer than what Vegas had. Tell me what you got.
It's a difficult one as well to predict, and a lot of it comes down to how you want to project these two teams and make a lot of inferences. The 13.5 number that's floating around from Vegas is telling to me. And what it really signals to me as much as anything, given the fact that Georgia struggled some defensively, given the fact that TCU looked very impressive, is there are some matchup issues going against TCU in this game. And I think Vegas viewed Michigan and TCU as being the third and fourth best team by some margin. We talked about a lot in our model and most metrics, and as we understood it in Vegas, Ohio State would have been favored against Michigan by a decent margin had they played again. I think that's true. And something that I note in terms of a matchup is Michigan against the run. Our opponent adjusted metrics is 87% against the run. They only held teams this year to 13% below their averages. So they were good, but they really weren't an elite run defense. Georgia's 70%, even after the Ohio State game. They are a considerably better run defense than Michigan was. And they did it against SEC competition, which you can talk about whether or not the SEC was the best conference, and then that's a difficult conversation to have, I think, because of opt-outs and whatnot. But the way the SEC performed at the high end was good enough that I don't think you can ding them this year. And so 70% against those offenses, I think, is pretty substantial. I just think Georgia is a much better run defense. So I think while Georgia probably has a lot of the same issues Michigan would have, the difference is I don't think Georgia has to blitz or be as aggressive as Michigan had to be against TCU. I think they're going to be able to handle the run game pretty well. And if they can handle the run game pretty well, that's going to put a lot of pressure on TCU in the passing game that they really didn't have to face against a Michigan team that was often kind of compromised. And the other side of the coin is, Michigan offensively is not nearly as good as Georgia. I mean, it's really not even close. And this comes to what I think is one of the biggest keys. I talked about a lot that the X factor, in my opinion, in the Georgia and Ohio State game, and now I had Georgia favored by more than I should have, and that was me maybe misunderstanding Georgia's defense. But on the offensive side of the ball, I expected him to score in the 40s. And there was a reason for that, and that's the fact that Georgia's receiving core is actually healthy. And if you looked at Georgia during the season, if you're somebody that only flipped on to them when they were playing Missouri or something, I don't think you understand how much having A.D. Mitchell back or Ian Smith back makes a difference for that offense. Really, their best receivers, they're guys that can stretch the field vertically. That gives them an aggressive component that Michigan did not have. Now, Stetson Bennett is not a gunslinger. He has to play within his offense. It's something Kirby Smart talked about a lot. But in terms of receiving weapons, in terms of offensive efficiency, the quarterback position, and not to mention the tight ends, because I don't know if Darnell Washington will play. Obviously, Brock Bowers is one of, if not the best tight ends in the country. But really, those other skill position players are at a different level. So TCU is going to give up points. My prediction in this game is 41-24 Georgia. I think TCU is going to struggle offensively to score at a high level. I think they're going to score some. I think they're going to move the ball fairly well. I don't think Georgia's going to be comfortable defensively, but the problem is I think Georgia's going to score a lot, and they're going to score the same way Michigan did, but better. I think this TCU offense, like, again, almost no defense in the country is really going to shut Georgia down. So I think this TCU offense is going to struggle to keep up. And at some point, that creates balance issues. And when you get balance issues against Georgia, when you're having to press, that's where they've tended to feast on teams. So I was wrong before picking a blowout with Georgia and Ohio State. I'm going to double down and pick it again with this game with TCU. I think it's a tough matchup for TCU. I think Georgia's just that much better than everyone else. And, I think really much the same way that Alabama and Kansas State went, where Kansas State played with them close. And at a certain point, the dam broke. Kansas State couldn't run the ball well enough to keep Alabama honest defensively, and things got out of hand. I think the same thing's going to probably happen to TCU in this game. And as much as Duggan is a very efficient passer and a very heady passer, I think they're going to struggle to throw the ball well enough to keep pace in a game where they can't really run. And so Georgia knows what's coming. Unlike the Ohio State game, where Ohio State was able to stay pretty balanced. And again, they had enough weapons that you couldn't bracket Harrison, whereas I do think Georgia can bracket Johnston and then just sort of deal with Barber and Davis and everyone else.
And, a quick note on the SEC. We're SEC homers apparently because we give pretty straightforward statistics, but the SEC, and this statistic doesn't include Georgia, so the SEC's 3, 4, 5, and 10 place teams beat Power 5 conference champions. So of the 6 out of conference wins against Power 5 conference champions, the SEC has 4 of them, and Georgia wasn't one of those teams that beat. Georgia still hasn't beaten a conference champion this year. So I think that to me is the statistic that sticks with me more than anything else, is that the SEC's middle of the pack, and in Florida's case, bottom of the pack, were able to beat other Power 5 conference champions. That says a lot to me. But that doesn't mean TCU played a junk schedule. Like we've said before, they can't help Colorado, and everybody plays cupcakes, in their other paycheck games. They still played 9 Power 5 games within their conference. So I don't think that they played, a trash schedule. I actually think the Big 12 was a good bit better than the Pac-12 this year. All right, that's it for us. Let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be, and we will chat with you down there and let you know how you are wrong or you're right if you agree with us. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.